Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AIMS COVID-19 webinar series. So today we'll be discussing the various aspects of critical care management of these patients with severe COVID-19 disease. So in the first talk, I'll be discussing about the management of critically ill COVID-19 patients in the ICU. As you all know that by this time when I'm delivering this talk, over 8 lakh people have been affected all over the globe and the death reaching 40,000. There is an urgent requirement of the ICU and hospital contingency plans being in place. The available data so far from China and other European countries suggests that around 10 to 15% of the COVID-19 patients affected reach hospital and require hospital admission, and 5% of the patients will be requiring ICU beds with mechanical ventilation. So in a country with such a huge population like in India, this 5% in absolute terms will reach many thousands of patients, and there is an urgent need that we gear up and have a contingency management plan in place. At the same time, the clinician, the healthcare provider should be ready and equipped with the knowledge and skills to deal with these patients. So we should have the important hospital and ICU admission criteria in place so that we can judiciously use the resources to tackle with the situation in the long-term basis. So first we need to know whom to admit in the hospital. So if you get a patient who is a COVID suspect, if the patient is having a mild disease, he can actually be managed in home quarantine or in isolation facilities developed by the various governments. But a patient who is having moderate to severe disease, like patients who has tachypnea of respiratory rate more than 24 per minute, or oxygen saturation decreasing to 94% or less on room air, PaO to FiO2 ratios of less than 300, or if they have signs of hypoperfusion like low blood pressure, altered mental status. So those group of patients will require urgent hospitalization. At the same time, there are few population who will be at risk of developing severe disease even if they present with mild disease. So this kind of population will also warrant admission to the hospital, like age more than 60, diabetic, hypertensive, significant cardiovascular disease, immunocompromised patients, or those suffering from chronic lung disease or renal or hepatic disease. Now, how do we manage these hospitalized patients? So since the COVID-19 predominantly affect the respiratory system, most of the patients admitted will be hypoxic, and you'll need oxygen to provide oxygen saturation to in the range of 92 to 96%. So you can use either simple face mask or nasal cannula to achieve that. However, the patients who deteriorate will need use of high flow nasal cannula or non-invasive ventilation devices. We should be a bit selective and cautious about the use of these high flow nasal cannulas and NIVs. More important is that during the time of hospitalization, these patients should be monitored very closely and vigilantly, so that you identify the set of patients who are going to develop severe hypoxia and decide on their intubation and urgent ICU transfer. At the same time, the other management principles remain same, like treating the comorbid conditions, obtaining a blood culture, and starting empirical antibiotic therapy. Regarding fluid strategy, we should be conservative at the beginning so that hypervolemia and flooding of the lungs should not occur in these patients. Now, coming to the ICU admission criteria, the patients will become eventually intubated and require mechanical ventilation or non-invasive form of mechanical ventilation. Hemodynamically unstable patients requiring vasopressor support, worsening of mental status, or developing any other organ dysfunction. This group of patients will require ICU admission. At the same time, we need to identify the factors which poorly prognosticate. For example, increase in the age, lymphopenia, high neutrophil lymphocyte ratios, rise in the level of LDH, D-dimers, and ferritins. So available data suggests that the people who will have this kind of issues are more likely to have adverse outcomes. So we need to be very careful about them. Now it's very important that we have the airway management protocol in place in the ICU. So the group of patients who are developing moderate to severe hypoxia and require intubation, you should follow a fixed protocol. So here it is. We pre-oxygenate the patient first for 3 to 5 minutes and with the use of closed circuit devices. Try to avoid use open circuits or ambu bag and mass ventilation as far as possible. If you have to use open circuits, always place an HME filter above the mask, between the mask and the circuit, so that you'll reduce the contamination of the exhaled air coming out. The induction should always be rapid sequence induction. Use either atomated or propofol depending on the hemodynamic status. Use succinyl choline or rocuronium for the muscle relaxation. You should use good dose of this muscle relaxant so that patient is fully relaxed and you have an easy intubation during the intubation attempts. It's very, very important that the experienced operator attempts intubation. So you should devise your roster in such a way that an anesthesiologist is present in each shift during the all working hours. Regarding the gadget, prefer to use video laryngoscope devices rather than the simple direct laryngoscopes, because in various studies video laryngoscopes have found that it increases the first attempt success rate as well as the overall intubation success rate. So here are the few video laryngoscope devices which are easily available in the market. So if you do not have these video laryngoscopes already in your armamentarium, please purchase and get them so that you have easy intubations during the pandemic if your ICUs are full of patients who require intubation and mechanical ventilation. The second important principle is that we should avoid aerosols as far as possible. This is mostly because of the concern of safety of the healthcare providers in the ICU and hospital wards. So avoid nebulization as far as possible. Prefer metered dose inhalers. And the patients who are on ventilators, always use HME filters and do not change the HME filters unless it is soiled or it's almost 5 to 7 days. The routine change of ventilator circuits is strongly discouraged, and change the circuit only when it is visibly soiled. Avoid all sorts of circuit disconnections, and if you at all have to do some circuit disconnection because of it is unavoidable, always clamp the endotracheal tube first and put the ventilator on standby mode before you disconnect the circuit. Regarding suctioning, open suctioning method is strongly discouraged. Use the closed suction catheter system so that you can suction without generating any aerosol. So here is the picture of a closed suction device. You have to connect the closed suction device end through the endotracheal tube or the tracheostomy tube, and circuit will be attached through a separate route, and the suction catheter will be continuously in place. Whenever you need to do the suctioning, you unlock the device here and insert the suction catheter, do the suctioning and lock it back again. So this is the way you should use a closed suction device system in these patients. Now ventilation strategy, we have a separate talk on that, so I will not waste time and come back to straight away hemodynamic management. So what data do we have so far in the hemodynamic instability of shock in COVID patients? So far the majority of the data from China show that around 1 to 5% of the cases develop shock, but in admitted ICU patients around 1/3 develop shock or hemodynamic instability. Predominantly the shock is septic shock. However, many of the patients may have cardiogenic shock. You have to keep it in your mind, because the cardiac injury was found in around 7 to 23% of patients in Chinese studies, whereas in one of the studies from China they reported the cause of death to be shock or myocarditis in as high as 40% of the patients in ICU. However, good robust data is not available. We do not yet know what are the risk factors for development of shock in these patients, or if they develop shock, what is the prognosis, or if early identification of underlying myocardial injury or myocardial dysfunction based on biochemical parameters like troponins or echocardiography, do they affect the prognosis of these patients? We do not know. So basically we need more evidence on the hemodynamic management of these patients. Meanwhile, the management, what we'll do, the hemodynamic management is basically extrapolated from our experience of non-COVID. So whenever you have stroke volume variation or pulse pressure variations available, always use this data to titrate the fluid therapy in your patient. Do not administer any exogenous fluid challenge. Try to use passive leg raising test as far as possible and interpret in the context of your patient's clinical status and decide on further fluid therapy. Now, other important parameters like lactate should be used quite often. The initial lactate level and the lactate clearance have already been found to be very handy in the resuscitation of these patients. However, if you are using lactate clearance, remember that there are certain other conditions which will increase your lactate levels falsely, and that might confound the use of lactate clearance data in the resuscitation of your patient. Another important clinical test which you can use is the capillary refill time. The Andromeda shock trial has shown us that the use of capillary refill time in the resource limited setup, use of this easy bedside test which can be repeated every 30 minutes is very important, and even outperforms the routine use of lactate clearance in terms of the survival of the patients are concerned. Now the next question comes, how much fluid you need to administer? Well, the answer is quite straightforward. We need to use the conservative fluid strategy over liberal fluid strategy, because there is enough data and subsequent meta-analysis of the randomized control trial performed consistently so that conservative fluid strategy in a patient who is suffering from sepsis with ARDS significantly reduces the length of ICU stay and length of mechanical ventilation days. So always choose conservative fluid strategy. Do not go by the blanket 30 ml per kg of fluid resuscitation, which is usually advocated in other septic shock resuscitation scenarios. So the WHO recommends that you use 250 to 500 ml of crystalloid boluses maximum in 15 to 30 minutes time, and continuously assess and reassess the patients and decide on further fluid administration strategies. Now the next question is, which fluid? The obvious answer is crystalloids. We have enough data to tell that colloids, particularly the hydroxyethyl starches, are detrimental to kidneys. There is increased incidence of kidney dysfunctions and renal replacement therapy requirement in septic patients who have been giving colloids freely. Increase in the transfusion requirements is there, and in few studies even mortality were increased. Moreover, in the resource limited setting, colloids may not be available always as well. It's costly. So you always prefer to use the crystalloids. Now, among the crystalloids, try to use Ringer's lactate or Ringer's acetates, these balanced crystalloid solutions, more often than using the normal saline, because the data from septic shock patients say that the normal saline in fact can cause kidney dysfunction and increase in the RRT requirements, and they can also cause hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. So we prefer to use balanced crystalloid solutions in fluid resuscitation. Next comes the role of vasopressors and the inotropes. So the target blood pressure, mean arterial pressure target is 65 mm of mercury, and you should be using noradrenaline as your first vasopressor of choice. There is no doubt about it. If noradrenaline is not available to you, then you can use vasopressin or adrenaline as the first choice. However, in a patient who is requiring escalating dose of noradrenaline, maybe more than 15 mics per minute or so, you should add a second vasopressor agent, and vasopressin is the second line vasopressor of choice in these circumstances. However, you should be well aware of the significant side effects arising out of these vasopressors. Tachyarrhythmias are uncommon with norepinephrine. However, it can happen quite commonly with adrenaline, and the increase in the lactate levels will prevent you using the lactate clearance data in the resuscitation if you are using adrenaline. Beware of the digital ischemia as well if you are using higher dose of vasopressin. Now regarding dopamine, the message is quite loud and clear. There is class 1 evidence that dopamine should not be used in such patients because it increases the chance of tachyarrhythmias quite significantly, and even non-significant increase in mortality were found in various studies, and various other side effects are also there. So dopamine should not be used. Now at times you may be requiring an inotropic agent as well. This is mainly you will find when you have a patient in shock, persistent shock despite fluid resuscitation and vasopressors, and lactates are increasing, cardiac output is decreasing, so you suspect myocardial failure. In those patients you add dobutamine. All these guidelines of vasopressors, fluids and inotrope therapies are largely extrapolated from the data available with the Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines arising out of management of septic shock. Now, regarding the various investigations in the ICU and imaging studies, I would like to state that the point of care ultrasound will become very important in the management of this patient population. This is because predominantly they will be hemodynamically unstable and they will be suffering from ARDS on mechanical ventilation strategies. Now chest x-ray you can do maximum once or twice a day, but you cannot use it as a dynamic parameter of management. So the point of care ultrasound will be very handy. Moreover, shifting these patients to CT scanner will be almost impossible. If you do not have a CT scanner available in your ICU, you need to have a separate COVID corridors, probably separate lifts, and the CT scanner area has to be decontaminated, disinfected once this CT scan has been done in COVID-19 patients. Moreover, all this will lead to more and more consumption of PPEs and more manpower. So use point of care ultrasound more often than not in the management of these patients. So I'd like to just mention the few salient points which you need to remember. What you can do with the use of POCUS in ICU in these patients. You can check the volume status of the patient by simply scanning the IVC. You place the subcostal echo probe or the curvilinear abdominal probe in the subcostal window and have a look at the IVC, whether they are full or they are empty. A quite full IVC with less movement will suggest patient has got good volume status, whereas a kissing IVC will suggest that the patient is probably fluid depleted. So just by looking at the IVC, you will have a good idea of such patient's volume status. However, in the mid zones, you can use the M mode through it and calculate the IVC collapsibility or the distensibility index, depending on whether the patient is on spontaneous breathing or controlled ventilation, and that will give you the idea of whether to go ahead with the further fluid resuscitation or not. Regarding cardiac dysfunction, you can easily identify with the echo probe in 4-chamber fuse how the heart is functioning, how is the contractility. Even if you do not know the exact calculations of, say, fractional shortenings or ejection fraction, it does not matter. Just by looking at the heart, you can easily identify which heart is moving well and which heart is not contracting well and grossly dilated. So that will give you a gross idea about contractility and the myocardial function of the patient. Similarly, lung ultrasound will also be handy. Majority of the patient will be suffering from ARDS. So if you put a ultrasound probe on the lung and you find this kind of patterns, this vertical lines arising out of pleura and reaching till the bottom of the screen, you will realize that these are the B lines and this is called B profile. Increasing severity of B profile with coalescent B lines suggests that further and further lung edema. So the presence of B profile basically suggests pulmonary edema, interstitial edema, and increasing coalescent B line suggests alveolar edema. So you can not only use this therapy to diagnose pulmonary edema, but also titrate your therapy, your fluid management strategies, your mechanical ventilation strategy. You calculate the lung aeration scores in all 12 lung zones and follow it up with your PEEP titration or recruitment maneuvers or prone positioning, and subsequently find how they are improving. Because doing ABG very frequently may not be an option if you have shortage of cartridges, and doing chest x-ray regularly or maybe couple of times or more in a day may not be possible. Similarly, many patients will develop significant pneumonia as well, the viral pneumonia or the superadded bacterial pneumonias. So this video shows the presence of subpleural consolidations. The subpleural consolidations in the peripheral areas suggest early phase of the pneumonia. As disease progresses, you may have more and more lobes getting affected, and you can see this kind of dynamic air bronchograms in the background of a consolidated lung tissue. Whereas in further advanced stage, you can have no aeration of the lung at all. The lung tissues is completely hepatized and there is no movement at all. So you can find at times this kind of pictures where part of the lung tissue above the diaphragm will be hepatized, like looking like the liver in the ultrasound, and part of the lung will be aerated. So all this kind of pictures will tell you how the point of care ultrasound will help you in diagnosing and as well as monitoring the response to your therapy in this kind of patients. Now don't forget about the routine ICU care. The routine ICU care is very important, particularly to prevent ICU acquired complications in this kind of patients. Now the basic principles of routine ICU care will remain the same. You always keep these patients in semi-recumbent position unless the patient is grossly hemodynamically unstable. The 30 to 45 degrees of head up tilt should be provided. Don't go beyond 45 degrees because that will increase the incidence of pressure sores. DVT prophylaxis is very important in this patient populations. Preliminary data coming out of China and Europe suggests that these patients are at risk of developing deep vein thrombosis and even pulmonary embolism. So always use low molecular weight heparin or unfractionated heparin prophylaxis. In a patient who has contraindications of heparin or have bleeding tendencies or actively bleeding, use mechanical prophylaxis in the form of intermittent pneumatic compression devices. Similarly, early use of enteral nutrition is very important. Try to start it within 24 to 48 hours. And stress ulcer prophylaxis should be continued in the form of H2 blockers or proton pump inhibitors in high risk group of patients, like those in mechanical ventilation for more than 48 hours, requiring renal replacement therapies, multi-organ dysfunction syndromes, and coagulopathies. Prevention of pressure sores is very important. As you can understand, the patients in ICU, majority of them will be in ARDS, they will be in deep sedations and possibly in paralysis. So regular change of positions in these patients to prevent pressure sores are very important. The patients who are in prone will be kept for 16 hours or so in the prone position. So all the pressure points has to be padded very carefully. If you have the gel pads available in your ICU, fair enough. If you don't have them, just put water in the gloves, tie them, and this water-filled gloves, you keep it below the pressure points like your ankle joints, knee joints, elbows, and other areas to prevent pressure sores. Glycemic control is very important. We don't need to go strict, we don't need to achieve strict glycemic controls. Just accept a glycemic range of around 150 to 180. That should be good enough. Now, weaning protocol should be placed in your ICU whenever the patient has started improving. You are able to come down on the ventilation setups. Daily sedation breaks and assessment for the readiness to weaning and SBT should always be performed. And whenever the patient improves a little bit, and you should think of starting early mobilization of these patients. Initially in-bed mobilization and later on out-bed mobilization. Now coming to the next part, the drug therapy. So the data what we have available so far, predominantly from China, suggests there is no specific drug which has really found to cure these patients. So the mainstay of therapy remains supportive. The current drug therapy which have been recommended based on predominantly in vitro studies or our limited clinical experience in these patient populations, or extrapolated from the experience of previous SARS or MERS epidemics, and on the basis of ongoing trials which are being undertaken in multiple countries. So few drugs I would like to discuss here. One is the chloroquine phosphate. The Chinese group initially reported the efficacy of chloroquine phosphate from their data on 100 patients, and they showed that there is significant clinical and radiological improvement as well as virological clearance when they used chloroquine phosphate 500 BD for around 10 days in these patients. Now, hydroxychloroquine can also be used, and the recent paper from France, which have come on 20th March, suggests that the combination of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin can be very handy in this patient population. Now, this French study is not a purely clinical study. It's more like a microbiological study where they used this hydroxychloroquine azithromycin combination versus hydroxychloroquine alone and standard care in 40 patients who were suffering from URI or LRTI of COVID-19. And if you see the data, the virological clearance was achieved almost all patients who were on hydroxychloroquine azithromycin combination, versus the patients who are in hydroxychloroquine alone did not achieve such virological clearance, and very few patients had virological clearance who were not receiving either of these drug therapy. So this suggests that there may be some role of hydroxychloroquine sulfate as of now. Now, another important drug combination, the antiretroviral drugs, lopinavir-ritonavir combination has also been tried, and again we have data from China which was published in NEJM on 18th of March. In their study, they did an open label RCT in 199 patients who were randomized to receive either lopinavir-ritonavir combination or the standard of care. And this was done in all hospitalized patients with low oxygenation and low PaO to FiO2 ratios. Now, the primary outcome was time to clinical improvement, and the other secondary outcomes were mortality, ICU stay, or the viral load. Now here remember that the lopinavir-ritonavir combination cannot be used in patients who have advanced cirrhosis, who are already suffering from HIV, because there is fear of developing resistance against these drugs in those patients, and people who are on already medications and like say rifampicin or voriconazole, which cannot be stopped, and this presence of these medications are contraindications to the use of lopinavir-ritonavir combination. This Chinese data show us that the primary outcome, time to clinical improvement, was median 16 days in both the groups, so which was not statistically significant at all. However, 3 patients had died early within first 48 hours in LPVR group. So excluding those 3 patients, when the modified intention to treat analysis was done, there was 1 day benefit was found in time to clinical improvement. However, the clinical benefit of this only 1 day remains questionable. If you see the mortality data, there was no significant difference in the percentage of population died on this in this study. However, it's interesting to find that in a group of patients in whom this LPVR combination was started within the initial 12 days from the symptom onset, had numerically much less mortality compared to the standard care. So this gives us a message to do more studies where LPVR combination has to be started much earlier. By the end of 7 days or 10 days, you have to take a call whether you are switching over these patients into LPVR combination. Now, there was also significant improvement in the ICU length of stay with the use of lopinavir groups, but the virological clearance almost remained same as the standard group. Now, following this trial, the ICMR has already started a nationwide study, randomized controlled trial in symptomatic hospitalized patients by with the use of this lopinavir-ritonavir combination for 14 days. And they're looking at these outcomes like mortality, length of hospital and ICU stay, various side effects, and viral RNA load. So if you have to use lopinavir-ritonavir combination, you have to contact ICMR as of now in India. Now, beware of important drug interactions. Like in hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine, the concern is QT prolongation and hypoglycemia. So if your patient is already on certain drugs which are known to cause QT prolongation like azithromycin, levofloxacins, or if you have heart failure, your baseline QT is already prolonged, then it's preferable to avoid all these medications. Lopinavir also have significant drug interactions with few drugs which are commonly used in ICU like fentanyl, midazolam. So have to be very careful when you are using these drugs in your ICUs. Now, based on this available data on the drug therapy in the AIIMS, in our protocol we suggest to the patients to start on hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin combination initially, and if they are not tolerating it or there is some contraindication or patient worsens on this therapy, then we will switch over to lopinavir-ritonavir combination as per the ICMR protocol. Now, talking about certain adjunctive therapies. Now, corticosteroid has always been controversial in various managements, and here also it is not without controversies. There is an initial publication from the China in non-peer-reviewed journals that use of low-dose corticosteroids like methylprednisolone 1 to 2 mg per kg per day have shown improved clinical profile of the patient as well as radiological improvement in CT scans. However, the previous experience with the use of corticosteroids in SARS and MERS outbreak and the synthesis of these studies in the form of systematic reviews by the Cochrane groups and meta-analysis performed and published in various other critical care journals suggests that use of systemic corticosteroids in viral pneumonia and ARDS patients did not have any survival benefit. Moreover, it increases the chance of secondary infections and delayed virological clearance. So there is a potential that the patients who have already recovered can continue to spread this virus because of this delayed clearance even if you have discharged them from the ICU. So based on this, WHO strongly recommends not to use systemic corticosteroids. The Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines released earlier had advocated that the systemic corticosteroids can be used, but the WHO guidelines go against this. However, it's important to know for everyone that if the patient is already on steroids for some other indications, you can continue it or even use it for refractory shocks when the shock is refractory to your vasopressor therapies. Now, there are initial reports about the use of convalescent plasma from patients who have recovered from these COVID infections. Now, this has already been tried before as well in SARS infections, in influenza pandemics. However, in MERS and Ebola outbreaks, these convalescent plasmas were not effective. But it was really effective in SARS pandemics, and the meta-analysis published in 2014 show that there is significant reduction in the mortality with the use of convalescent plasma in this group of patients. So in COVID-19, we have so far data from only 5 critically ill patients, again coming from China, where they used this convalescent plasma from people who have recovered from SARS-CoV-2 infection with high IgG titers. And all these 5 critically ill patients who are on ARDS on invasive mechanical ventilation. So in all of them, the viral load became negative by the end of second week, and they could be weaned off ventilator. 3 of them have already been discharged by the end of second month, and the rest 2 are still there in the hospital. So based on this, the FDA has already approved the use of convalescent plasma in the setting of clinical trial in USA. So pending the report of clinical trial, we should not start using all these therapies. Now, there are several ongoing trials with the use of various drugs like remdesivir. Remdesivir is an agent which inhibits the viral replication at the RNA transcription level, and multicentric RCTs at as many as 3 or more are going on currently, one in China and others in various countries, predominantly from USA and other countries. The results of these are expected to come in couple of months' time. The WHO has launched the Solidarity trial, which is essentially a 4-arm trial where 4 interventions are started simultaneously: the remdesivir, the lopinavir-ritonavir combination, chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, and lopinavir-ritonavir in combination with the interferon beta. So we have to wait for the results of the Solidarity trial. Vitamin C has got significant anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties, and in China they have started a trial with the use of high dose vitamin C for 7 days, and the results are still pending. Similarly, already there is a concern that this viral pneumonia ARDS patients do have significant cytokine storms. So why not try with the interleukin 6 receptor antagonist tocilizumab? So the trial has already been started in USA. So the point is that we need to have more and more trials, and we have to wait for the data, clinical data coming out of these trials. So our researchers will remain busy to find out the effective therapy. The search will go on. At the same time, the clinicians, we should have our armamentarium ready, our knowledge and skills sharpened, and be ready to face the increased surge of patients in our ICUs. So to summarize, early identification of high-risk cases is very, very important. Hospitalize them, and if required, admit them in the ICU based on the ICU admission criteria. The mainstay of therapy will remain supportive. You should be very, very careful about the infection control practices and aerosol prevention strategies. The details will be discussed in subsequent webinars. The mechanical ventilation strategy we'll be discussing again in the separate talk. The hemodynamic support remains very, very important. General ICU care to prevent superadded complications you must not forget. And drugs and adjunctive therapies will continue to evolve, and we will continue to use the drugs based on the current evidences and as the situation evolve. So with the continued effort of not only the healthcare providers or the researchers, but also the government, who is trying very hard to reduce the outbreak of the disease, and the continued effort, most importantly, of each and every citizen who is trying to stay back at home and contributing to the mitigation of the outbreak of the disease. All this I sincerely wish that come good, and we are able to wipe this coronavirus off from our country like this. Thank you very much.